Welcome to the Kennedy Report. I'm Kennedy Hall. Welcome to TKR. We are going to talk today about how, blast from the past, Sheen, Bishop Fulton Sheen, comes to defend Archbishop Vigano's views on Russia and Fatima, specifically Russia's errors. Before I continue, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, visit the links in the description to find out what we have going on to help support us, see if my books are for sale down there, and so on and so forth. Thank you to everybody who has signed up and who has supported. If you want to get updates on when the shows are going to be released, go to thekennedyreport.com, click the link in the description and find out how. Okay, so here's an article here, and it was written by Barbara Farah. It was at Crisis Magazine. I was looking through this thing, and I was astonished by it. It is so good. It's called Mary the West and Russia's Errors, a Defense of Archbishop Vigano. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to read a lot of it because I was breaking it down. Maybe you can see there I've sort of highlighted things, and I thought, okay, I'll highlight this part, I'll highlight that part. But it's kind of like when you look in your New Testament and you're just going to highlight some things and you realize you've highlighted the entire Gospel of Matthew. You just can't let any of it slip. This is really good, so I'm going to read a lot of it. So let's get to it. So if you don't know what's going on recently, Archbishop Vigano has come out with his opinion about the war in Russia and Ukraine. Sorry, the war in Ukraine with Russia. Now, you may disagree with his views on it. That's fine. You know, people have their different views on war. It's usually very difficult to find who's completely at fault and so on and so forth. You know, that's neither here nor there. But the theme of Vigano's views are that basically, for all of Russia's faults, there's a God-centered approach to the Russian empire, if you want to call it that, whereas Ukraine is basically taken over by leftist globalist powers. That may or may not be true. That's his view, but the theme behind that is what we're going to talk about here and what she does talk about in this. So one author, his name was Michael Warren Davies. He's an amazing author. He really is. But he basically accused Archbishop Vigano of looking east with some rose-colored glasses and wanting to become Eastern Orthodox or something like that. And she comes to Vigano's defense and says, you know what? Vigano is saying things that like Fulton Sheen used to say. So she says, in his writings on Fatima and Russia, the Venerable Fulton Sheen pointed out that the world has become so used to judging temporal events in terms of other events that it has lost sight of the greater standard of judgment, which is the eternal. So, responding to the criticism that Vigano had become, quote unquote, swept away by trends in modern politics, and he has let the clamor of current events drown out the voice of God and blind him to the evils of the Russian government. She says, I strongly disagree. She says, in fact, if we look at Vigano's writings in light of Sheen's discussion on Fatima, we can see that just the opposite is true. Far from Vigano being the one drowning out the voice of God, it's actually the entire Western world that has done so. To understand this, we need to step back and address what Mary meant when she spoke of Russia's errors. Now, this part floored me, so I'll paraphrase this part. Usually what we say, and I've said this before, so maybe I was wrong. I mean, I think there's multiple ways to see it, but we say that Our Lady came at Fatima to warn of the errors of communism. This author says, there are several reasons to reject this interpretation. First, she spoke of those errors in her July appearance, months before the communists took over. Now, you could say it's a prophecy, but and that's possible, but she adds something to this here. She says, the February Revolution that had been already taken place in Russia was the bourgeois democratic revolution that basically was a thing to get rid of the power of the czarist monarchy and give the democracy the power. So there already was a revolution. So it could be said that if you were hearing this thing about errors of Russia, there was a historical event that had taken place just months prior, and you might be thinking, well, is Our Lady warning of democracy? That would actually be a reasonable way to interpret it. So she thinks, this author at least, that it's not specifically about communism. And she adds that further, communism was not newly spawned in Russia in 1917. By that time, it had been spreading its errors across Europe and the world for more than 70 years. This is true. And she says, if Our Lady meant communism, why not just say communist or communist errors? Why just errors? Fascinating question. She goes back to Fulton Sheen and says, Sheen points us in a different direction, specifically to the year 1858. He asks us to look at the world events of that year, not only those, but the eternal ones as well, rejecting the commonly held view that the modern age started with the rise of science, something that it is not at odds with when it's properly understood. Sheen argues that it began instead with the writing of 3 seminal books, and this is fascinating. They all came out in the same year. Origin of the Species by Charles Darwin, John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, and Karl Marx's A Contribution of the Critique of Political Economy, one of Marx's works about socialist economics. In those three works, Mann summarized the errors of the modern age. So we have materialism, we have unadulterated licentiousness, calling it freedom, and we have sort of socialist economics. Those are pretty big. She says, those are not the errors of communism. Communism may contain some of those, but those are actually the errors of what she calls modernism. They are errors that have to do with the modern man's denial of God, of creation, of God's authority over man, of any obedience to him. Sheen points out that what was effectively said in those works in that year of 1858 was that all men are immaculately conceived, all born without original sin. For if there was no divine revelation or divine creation, there was no fall. If there's no fall, there's no original sin. If there's no original sin, then all men are born immaculate and free to be whatever they want to be, answerable and in need of no higher authority. That happened in 1858. What else happened in 1858? That's the same year as the apparition at Lourdes, where Our Lady appeared to St. Bernadette and said, I am the Immaculate Conception. Sheen points out that at that very moment, the world was denying original sin. Our Blessed Mother claimed the prerogative solely as her own. She alone and uniquely was immaculately conceived. Everyone else was born in original sin. So in the Blessed Mother's appearance at Lourdes, Sheen notes that God answered man's arrogant claim of independence and provided proof of his errors. So the materialistic evolution answered. Freedom from God answered. Socialist economics answered. Okay. Her very appearance said, yes, there is more than matter. Yes, there is a God. Yes, there is a heaven. Yes, man was born with original sin. And yes, man owes obedience to God and reparations for the sins committed against him. Every error contained in those three works was contradicted in that one announcement, I am the Immaculate Conception. So this is where Fulton Sheen says begins the modern age, not with science and reason, but with the denial of original sin and God's response. Now, she goes on to say that the church had already talked about communism before the apparition of Our Lady of Fatima, which is true. So this is part of more of her reasoning why we don't have to interpret it the same way it's always been interpreted. This is her opinion, not necessarily mine, where Fatima is all about communism, because the church had been talking about these things. But what was really happening right now is that Russia was coming forth with this really damnable sort of communism. She says, if we look at to all the writings of the church throughout this time, what we see is increasing concern not just over the errors themselves, but in the increasing belief that man could fix the human condition through the creation of a godless state, through the implementation of mere economic and political change. And that is what was new in Russia. So communism, not new, but what was new in Russia? The godless state. In the February Revolution, and then to be completed in the Bolshevik Revolution in the fall or winter, the successful creation of a political body that incorporated all those errors, a secular state that, apart from any reference to God at all, claimed to be able to solve the problems inherent in the human condition, a state that said no to God, no to any authority higher than itself, and no to the natural law. A state that would be powerful enough to spread those errors across the world. As Sheen put it, Russia gave political form and social substance to the despiritualization of the Western world. Very fascinating. The danger in believing, this is according to her, the danger in believing Mary was pointing specifically to communism and to Russia, Russia lay in believing the problem is Russia and the error of communism, when in fact the error is believing that man is nothing more than a rational animal. Nothing more than a rational animal, evolution, Darwinian evolution, who can fix all his social problems through the political and economic policies enacted by a secular state. In fairness, there are other commentators. Hugh Owen at the Colby Center, he has talked about how evolution is inherent in the errors of Russia. So kudos. She's not the first person to think of that, but it's interesting to see somebody else say it. When Mary appeared at Fatima, her first announcement was, anyone in the class want to put up their hands? Her first announcement was, I am from heaven. So in the same way, Our Lady comes in 1858 to respond to those three works from Darwin, John Stuart Mill, and Marx. At the same year where the godless state, fully godless, because it hasn't been this way. It hadn't been that way. The fully godless state, as that was being created, she comes and says, I am from heaven. So she says, this is as God responded to mankind's announcement of its separation from him in 1858, so he responded in 1917 to its erection of a godless state. As the new path to human happiness and freedom, Mary stepped into time and announced that heaven exists. And if heaven exists, then there is higher authority. Salvation and redemption will not come from a man-made state, but from God, and only from God. And to prove this, to drive the message home, Mary would appear 6 times. Amazing. She continues, she says, as the Soviet state grew and indeed did spread its errors across the world, not the errors of communism only, but rather the modernist errors that man is independent and can create his own path to utopia by means of a secular state. This happened. Throughout the West, in country after country, man began to turn the government, the state, to the government and to the state to solve more and more of his social problems. Care for the poor shifted to the state. Mediation of class conflict. I mean, you've seen these things all before. We're now living in an age where that's been the most clear, where we even think that the state should solve all of our health issues when it's not really equipped to do so. Even the church has gone down this path. The church has looked to organizations to solve all of man's human condition. Sheen drives home the point, she says, again and again, that the errors were not specific to Russia or communism. They caught fire in capitalist countries as well. He notes that there is a closer relation between communism and monopolistic capitalism than most minds suspect. And notice here, she did say monopolistic. We're not criticizing capitalism per se, but just the crony type that we see. Continues, they are agreed on the materialistic basis of civilization. They disagree only on who should control the basis, capitalists or bureaucrats. And further, he says, capitalistic economy is godless. Communism makes economies of God, or makes economies God. Capitalism denies that economics is subject to a higher moral order. Communism says that economics is morality. Fascinating, 2 sides of the same coin. So, in fact, he highlights how the church has been opposed to monopolistic crony capitalism, as it has been to communism. And this has happened. We can see this in various writings from popes. So her opinion is Vigano is saying similar things. The issue is not that Vigano is blind to the evils of the Russian government. It is that the West is blind to the evils that have permeated its own existence to its very core. It is the modernist church that is blind to the evils of thinking it right to replace sacraments with social action, taking government money to feed bellies at the expense of feeding souls. Vigano looks at the World Economic Forum, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations, NATO, the European Union, and all other associations that have risen in the West, and sees them not in terms of otherworldly events, but in terms of the eternal. He sees them as Pope Leo XIII saw the secular associations of his day, efforts by man to fix the problems of the world apart from God and his church. This will always lead to failure. This is a Tower of Babel, something like that. Vigano also sees that what they're trying to do is create a new, even more powerful state than the Russian one Mary warned us about, a global state with a declared goal of creating a new world order and a new transhuman creature. Modernism stripped man of his spiritual nature. Transhumanism seeks to rip him of his most basic human nature, reducing him to a mere machine perfected by technology and microbiology. Wow, this is a wonderful article. Kudos to this author. Vigano has not become so absorbed with politics, she says. He has become absorbed with the eternal. He sees the eternal in the affairs of the day, including both those things God seems to be moving, as well as those things Satan seems to be moving. We don't know if the consecration occurred the way that Our Lady asked. She wrote this. I think she wrote this just right after. Anyway, I believe the consecration was done properly. But she says, Vigano asks us to look at world events, not just in terms of other world events, but in terms of spiritual events. What we do know is that the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989. And we know that since that time, Russia has been undergoing a re-Christianization while the entire Western world has been experiencing a de-Christianization. Again, I don't believe the consecration 1984 was the one Our Lady asked for. I believe the one that Pope Francis did was. However, Fatima devotees will tell you that there is something about the 1984 one where John Paul II did consecrate the world to the Immaculate Heart, where there could be some benefit. Perhaps that's the falling of the Soviet Union. I don't know. But Vigano asks us to see that it isn't really Russia or communism or capitalism that we're battling, but rather the principalities, demons, the satanic forces that seek to enslave all men to a godless globalist state. He asks us to consider that God is giving Russia, re-Christianizing Russia, the chance to atone for its sins by being the very thing that prevents that global state from being created. That part is incredible. Again, this is not to say anything about Ukrainian people or Russian people. This is not to say that Putin's a good guy or Putin's a bad guy or Zelensky. Nothing about that. But you're saying in God's providence, Russia has a special role to play. And in this moment of Marian consecration right now, it's pretty astonishing what's happening. She says, in turning our eyes and hearts to Mary, are we not finally conceding, agreeing with Pope Leo XIII, that apart from God, there will be no peace? Apart from God, no merely human institution, no godless state, no matter how big, how global, is going to save us. And is that not just like our God, she asks, the most modernist pope of all time, leading the world to renounce the fundamental errors of modernism through what? Consecration of Russia and Ukraine, to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Astonishing. Is it not a fitting way for the eternal to announce the end of the modern age? I hope she's right. At just that moment when man can't even define what a woman is, God reminds us that it is to a woman that he has given the power to overcome all evil. A woman who will crush the head of the serpent, modern man, lost Jesus. His mother has returned to help us find him. She has experience in that. Bravo to Miss, I don't know if it's Mrs. or Miss, I can't tell by her thing, to Barbara Farah. Unbelievable. And it says in her bio, she's a former Marxist atheist. If she sees this, please reach out to me. Reach out to me. You can find my link at the Kennedy Report, the website, in the link in the description. Incredible. I was floored reading this. I didn't read the whole thing, but I almost did because it was so good. So Bishop Sheen, Bishop Vigano seem to be on the right side of history and understanding the truth about Russia's errors. Very fascinating. Okay, well, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Again, for the statements I've made about Fatima, I speak for myself here, not for any other Fatima organization, just so you know. Okay, this has been wonderful, and I hope that I find more of her work because she is just so good. Again, if she could reach out to me and she sees this, that's great. If you do want to help us grow in our efforts here, please do, and look at the links in the description. You can find out how to donate, get on our mailing list. We have premium subscription things coming. We are days, maybe a week or two away from having things set up here for some more better cameras and lights in studio and things like that. And we need your help to do that. And we're almost there. If you could visit the link in the description, help us out. Okay, this has been the Kennedy Report. Until next time, God bless.